Assumptions can destroy everything. A single moment, a single unchecked bias, and everything can change. For Officer Linda Carson, the evening had been uneventful. Just another routine shift on the streets of Columbus. But a simple traffic stop, an ordinary violation, and the wrong assumption would unravel everything she thought she knew about control, authority, and consequences. Because tonight, Linda wouldn't just be enforcing the law, she would be crossing the line. The evening air was crisp, carrying the last warmth of the fading sun. The streets of Columbus had settled into a steady rhythm, the rush-hour frenzy replaced by a quieter hum of activity. Officer Linda Carson sat in her cruiser, parked near an abandoned lot, watching the city exhale after a long day. She had been on the force for 15 years, and night shifts like these were her favorite. Predictable, controlled, uneventful. There was something about the stillness of the evening that made her feel at ease. She glanced at the clock. 7:12 p.m. Another hour or so, and the city would belong to the night owls, the restless souls who came alive after dark. A few cars rolled by, their headlights slicing through the dimming light. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Then she saw it, a sleek black sedan gliding through an intersection ahead. Linda's gaze sharpened. The car looked expensive, the kind driven by executives or high-ranking officials, not something she often saw in this part of town. It was one of those high-end models, the type that didn't just transport people, but made a statement. Everything about it seemed ordinary, except for one thing: no turn signal. Her fingers instinctively hovered over the switch for her cruiser lights. It was a minor violation, barely worth the trouble. Most officers wouldn't bother stopping someone for it. But Linda had been on the job long enough to know that minor stops could lead to bigger discoveries. Sometimes a routine traffic violation uncovered something serious: an outstanding warrant, an unregistered firearm, or a suspect trying to slip through the cracks unnoticed. Other times, it was nothing, just an oversight. She hesitated. A second passed, then she flicked her lights on. Ahead, the sedan's brake lights flared and it pulled over smoothly without hesitation. Too smooth, if she was being honest. That gave her pause. Most drivers hesitated, even if just for a second. There was always a moment of delay, a flicker of uncertainty. But this driver? Instant compliance. That didn't sit right with her. Linda put her cruiser in park and took a deep breath, adjusting her belt. Her fingers brushed against her radio, an old habit she had developed over the years, making sure backup was just a call away, even if she didn't think she'd need it. She stepped out. The cool air hit her skin, but she barely noticed. Her boots crunched against the asphalt as she approached the driver's side window. She felt that familiar rush, the low buzz of adrenaline that always accompanied a stop. The window rolled down slowly, deliberately, the glass disappearing into the door with measured precision. Linda tilted her head slightly, her posture firm but relaxed, and then she saw him. A black man, mid-40s, neatly trimmed beard, wearing a tailored navy suit. The kind of man who belonged in a car like this. His hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, fingers still, his posture composed. No panic, no nervous fidgeting, just waiting. And for reasons Linda couldn't explain, that unsettled her. The man in the driver's seat turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Linda's with a calm, unwavering focus. He was in his mid-40s, his beard neatly trimmed, his navy blue suit crisp and tailored, the kind of man who carried himself with a natural authority. Everything about him looked precise, intentional, from the way he sat with perfect posture to the way his fingers rested lightly on the steering wheel, completely still. Most drivers showed some level of unease when pulled over, even those who weren't guilty of anything. There was always that moment, a nervous glance, a shaky hand reaching for the glove compartment, a rushed explanation before she even asked for one. Not this man. He didn't fidget, didn't shift in his seat, didn't even clear his throat. Just waited. Linda felt a subtle discomfort creep in, like an itch at the back of her mind that she couldn't quite reach. It wasn't what he did. It was what he didn't do. License and registration. Her voice came out firmer than necessary, a reflex she didn't fully understand. The man blinked once before he moved. Slowly, deliberately, Every motion was measured, like he already knew that anything too fast, too abrupt, could be misconstrued. He reached for the glove compartment, his movements controlled, practiced, as if he had done this before. Too many times. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" His voice was even, controlled. No challenge, no aggression, just a question. Linda felt her spine stiffen. She didn't like that either. Something about his tone, not defiant, but not submissive either, made her feel like he was testing her, even if he wasn't. She crossed her arms. "You failed to signal a turn." A beat passed. Not a reaction, not a change in expression, just a brief moment of silence. "Did I?" His voice remained neutral. No frustration, no argument. Just that question. Linda's jaw tightened. Most people either apologized or got defensive. But this man? He sounded like he already knew the answer. He retrieved his license and registration, holding them out with the same quiet confidence he had maintained since she walked up. His hands were steady. No tremor. No hurried movements. He didn't rush to explain himself or offer an excuse. That bothered her more than it should have. She took the ID from his hand, her fingers gripping it a little too tightly as she turned it over. Something about this stop was starting to feel different, and she didn't like that one bit. Linda barely glanced at the name on his ID before flipping it over. She wasn't sure why, but something about the way he handed it to her so steadily, so casually, rubbed her the wrong way. People usually showed some emotion when she took their license. Nervousness, impatience, frustration. But this man? Nothing. His face was calm, unreadable, not afraid, not apologetic. Just there. Linda's fingers tightened around the ID. "Do you live around here?" she asked, her tone edged with something she couldn't quite name. The man inhaled through his nose, a measured, controlled breath. Then he exhaled, slow and steady. "I don't see how that's relevant." His voice was polite but firm, and that only made her irritation spike. That answer. It wasn't disrespectful, wasn't confrontational, but it wasn't the answer she expected. Linda had been on the force for over a decade. She knew when someone thought they could outmaneuver her. She knew when someone thought they were above the law. And right now, this man gave her that feeling. A cold, sharp feeling she couldn't shake. Her grip tightened around his ID. "Step out of the vehicle." For the first time, she saw a shift in his expression. Not fear, not even anger, just the slightest tightening of his jaw. And that made something inside her clench. Why? His voice was still calm, but there was a different weight to the question now. Linda straightened. "I asked you to step out." A pause. Then, finally, he sighed. Not in defeat, but as if he already knew how this was going to go. He unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed the door open, and stepped out. Linda took an involuntary step back. She hadn't expected him to be so tall, so broad-shouldered. He didn't move aggressively, didn't tower over her, but his presence felt heavy, a quiet kind of power, the kind that made her pulse pick up. "Hands on the trunk." He hesitated for just a second, not because he planned to refuse, but because he was processing something. Then, without a word, he turned, moved deliberately, and placed his palms flat against the cool metal of the car. Linda took a breath, trying to steady herself. This was her moment. The moment to remind him who was in charge. The moment to reaffirm her control. She took a step forward, her hand hovering just above his back, and somewhere deep inside her, something ugly stirred. Linda's hand pressed firmly against his upper back, guiding him forward just slightly. It wasn't necessary. He had already complied. He had already placed his hands on the trunk. But she did it anyway, because something about him unsettled her, because his calmness, his unshaken confidence, felt like a quiet defiance, and because, for some reason, it frustrated her. Nathaniel Grant's muscles tensed under her palm, a barely noticeable reaction, but she felt it, and in that split second, before she even registered what she was doing, her palm struck his face. Crack! The sound of the slap sliced through the night air, sharp and unforgiving. The man's head jerked to the side, his cheek stinging red under the dim glow of the streetlights. And then, nothing. No outburst, no retaliation, no anger, just silence, thick, heavy, suffocating. Linda's own breath hitched in her throat. The weight of what she had just done settled in her chest like a stone. She hadn't planned this. She hadn't thought about it, but she had done it. And now, she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't take back. The man remained completely still, his hands still resting on the cold metal of his car. For a moment, he didn't react, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head back toward her. His expression was impossible to read. No rage, no fear, no shock. Just an unblinking stare, sharp, precise, calculated. A single muscle in his jaw clenched. Once, then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his jacket pocket. Linda's stomach twisted violently, her pulse slammed against her ribs. She took a half step back, her mind racing. Was he going for a weapon? Had she just made the biggest mistake of her career? Her fingers inched toward her holster. But then, he pulled out an ID, held it up just enough for her to see. The name on it stopped her heart. Nathaniel Grant. Her breath caught. Her eyes flickered down to the title beneath his name. And that was when the ground beneath her feet collapsed. Chief of Police. Linda's fingers went numb. Her mind shut down. She had just assaulted her superior, the Chief of Police. Nathaniel Grant just watched her, still unreadable, still silent. But this was far from over. Linda's body felt like it had locked up. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The ID in her hand suddenly felt heavier than anything she had ever held. The words on it, Nathaniel Grant, Chief of Police, were burning into her brain, branding themselves deep into her consciousness, her regret, her fear. But the worst part? He still hadn't said a word. No reaction, no anger, no threats. Just silence. And somehow, that silence was worse than anything else he could have done. If he had shouted at her, if he had grabbed his radio and called it in, if he had arrested her on the spot, that would have been easier. She knew how to handle anger. She didn't know how to handle this. A sharp burst of headlights flashed across the pavement. A second patrol car rolled up behind her cruiser. Linda blinked, her mind struggling to catch up, as a familiar voice called out, "Everything okay?" Officer Reynolds, her partner. His footsteps were slow as he approached, his gaze flicking between Linda and the man standing in front of her. Nathaniel Grant finally moved. He turned, his ID still in his hand, and for the first time, he spoke. Fine. His voice was too calm, too smooth, too controlled. Your officer was just conducting a stop. Linda felt her stomach turn. Reynolds frowned, picking up on something that wasn't being said. He looked at Linda now, really looked at her. She must have looked pale, shaken, wrong. "Carson?" Reynolds prompted, his brow furrowing. But before she could speak, Grant's voice cut through the air again. He turned back to her, his dark eyes pinning her in place. "Am I free to go, Officer Carson?" Linda's throat tightened. This was it. This was the moment she could salvage control, or completely lose it. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. A low chuckle rumbled from Grant's throat. It wasn't amused. It wasn't angry. It was just cold. And then, one final time, he spoke. "Are you detaining me?" Reynolds fully turned toward her now, his expression shifting from confusion to something else. Concern. Linda knew what was happening. This wasn't just a simple question. This was a test, and she had already failed the first part. The words burned her throat as she forced them out. "No, sir." Grant's lips pressed together as he gave a slow nod, slipping his ID back into his pocket. Then, without another word, he turned, stepped back toward his car, slid into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life, smooth as ever. Linda stood frozen as the black sedan eased back onto the road, disappearing into the night. The moment the car was gone, Reynolds stepped closer. His voice was lower now. "Linda, what the hell was that?" Linda barely heard him, because deep down she already knew. Chief Grant wasn't done with her yet, and soon she would find out exactly what that meant. Linda barely slept that night. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, the glow of the street lamp outside casting dim streaks of light across her room. Her mind refused to be quiet. It kept replaying the moment over and over, the way her hand had struck his face, The way Grant had slowly turned back to her. No anger, no shouting, just that look. Controlled, patient, and dangerous in its stillness. That silence was what had haunted her the most. If he had yelled, if he had thrown down his badge and demanded her immediate arrest, maybe she could have processed it. But he hadn't. He had just let it sit. Let her sit with it. She checked her phone for the 10th time since sunrise. Nothing. No missed calls. No messages. Maybe he wasn't going to report it. Maybe she had gotten lucky. Maybe... Her phone buzzed. Linda's stomach clenched so tightly it hurt. 10 a.m., internal affairs. Report to the chief's office immediately. Her pulse pounded as she forced herself upright, her limbs feeling heavy, disconnected. She got dressed slowly, buttoning her uniform with shaking fingers. By the time she was behind the wheel of her cruiser, her whole body felt cold. The city outside looked the same, but it felt different. Like it knew what she had done. Like the buildings, the people, the streets were all watching her. By the time she pulled into the station, she could already feel it. The moment she stepped inside, the usual hum of conversation dulled. People weren't staring, not directly, but she could feel it. They knew. She didn't know how, but they did. She kept her head down as she walked to the elevator, avoiding the side glances, the whispers. Her own reflection in the elevator doors looked foreign. Tense shoulders, drawn face, lips pressed together so tightly they were turning white. The doors slid open. The hallway stretched ahead of her. Too long, too quiet. She forced herself forward, every step too slow and too fast at the same time. When she reached the chief's office, she hesitated for just a second. Then, with a shaking hand, she reached for the handle and stepped inside. Nathaniel Grant was sitting at his desk, flipping through a file. He didn't look up. Not immediately. But she wasn't alone. To the side, Captain Howard stood, arms crossed, his face unreadable. The air in the room was thick, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Grant lifted his gaze, his expression calm, measured, in control. "Officer Carson," he said smoothly. He gestured to the chair in front of him. "Sit." Linda lowered herself into the chair, her muscles stiff, her movements slow and mechanical. The room felt smaller than it should have. The air, too thick. Across from her, Chief Nathaniel Grant leaned back in his chair, fingers laced together, his expression as calm and unreadable as it had been the night before. He let the silence stretch, let it sit between them like a weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it harder to breathe. He was waiting, watching, letting her feel every second of it. Finally, he spoke. "Tell me, Officer Carson." His voice was smooth, controlled, too controlled. "How would you report last night's stop?" Linda's throat was dry. She had rehearsed this in her head a dozen times since this morning, trying to find a way to say it that would make it less damning. But there was no way to soften it. She swallowed. Routine stop for failure to signal. Grant nodded, as if he had already predicted that answer. And what happened next? Her pulse pounded in her ears. The words caught in her throat, but she forced them out. She hesitated. Then, quieter, "I struck the suspect." For the first time, Grant's expression shifted, a slight raise of his brow. "Suspect?" There was an edge in his voice now. She shouldn't have used that word. She knew it the second it left her mouth. Grant leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. "Did I resist?" Linda clenched her jaw. "No, sir." "Did I insult you?" She forced herself to meet his gaze. "No, sir." Grant exhaled, a slow, measured breath. Then his voice dropped just slightly. Not louder, but colder. "Then tell me, Officer Carson." His eyes bored into her, unblinking. "Why did you hit me?" The words landed like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She couldn't say the real reason, that she had been frustrated, that his calmness unsettled her, that he hadn't acted how she expected him to, that she had wanted him to look afraid. Grant watched her, studying her like a puzzle he had already solved. Then, after a long pause, he slid a single piece of paper across the desk. Linda didn't have to look at it to know what it was. Her stomach dropped anyway. She forced herself to glance down. "Suspension notice. You're off duty until further notice," Grant said simply. Linda's hands shook as she reached for it. "Chief Grant, But he was already standing. Already done. Dismissed. Linda sat on her couch, her hands gripping the suspension notice so tightly that the edges had begun to curl. She had read it at least a dozen times, but the words never changed. Indefinite administrative leave pending review. 15 years on the force. Never once suspended. And now? Now, she was a headline waiting to happen. Her phone sat on the coffee table, screen dark. No calls, no texts, nothing. It was as if she had been erased overnight. She hadn't expected sympathy, but the silence? The silence felt like a slow suffocation. For 3 days, she drifted between her couch and her bed, barely eating, barely moving. She kept waiting for the next hammer to drop, for someone to call and tell her she was fired, for Grant to change his mind and press charges. But the call that finally came was worse in a different way. It was from the department. Mandatory de-escalation and bias training. She felt her jaw clench as she gripped the phone. It was a formality, a box to check before deciding whether she was salvageable or not. Still, when the day arrived, she forced herself to show up. The training room was small and cramped, the air stale. A dozen other officers sat at folding tables, arms crossed, faces blank. Some were rookies, some were veterans like her. No one wanted to be there. At the front of the room stood the instructor, a retired black detective named Joanna Pierce. She was in her 60s, her presence commanding in a way that needed no badge. She swept her gaze over the room, assessing them like she already knew what was coming. Then, without a word, she clicked the projector remote. A body cam video flickered onto the screen. Linda sat up a little straighter. The footage was grainy, unfiltered, a patrol car pulling up behind a black sedan. The officer, white, approached the driver's side. Routine stop. Failure to signal. The man in the car was calm, compliant, until the officer's tone shifted. Something in his voice sharpened. The frustration built. The officer snapped. The interaction escalated, not because the driver was aggressive, but because the officer assumed he would be. Linda's breath stilled in her chest. It was a scene she had watched before, a scene she had lived. The screen went dark. Joanna Pierce folded her arms and turned to the class. "Let's talk about assumptions," she said. Then, her eyes locked onto Linda. "Officer Carson." Linda stiffened. What did the officer see when he pulled that man over? Linda's pulse pounded. She already knew the answer. She just didn't want to say it. Still, she swallowed hard and forced the word out. "A threat." Pierce nodded. "And what did you see when you pulled over Chief Grant?" Linda's breath caught. The room felt too warm, the air too thick. She closed her eyes. "A threat." Pierce's voice remained steady. "And was he?" Linda stared at the table, her face hot with shame. Silence stretched. Finally she whispered, "No." And for the first time, she saw it. 2 months. 60 days of forced reflection. 60 days of silence. 60 days of replaying that night, of watching the moment again and again, the way her hand had moved before her brain had caught up, the way Grant had looked at her afterward, the way she had felt small in that office when he slid the suspension notice across the desk. Now, after all of it, she was back, but nothing felt the same. As she walked into the station, she felt it immediately. Every conversation that had been happening just seconds before seemed to dip in volume. No one said anything to her. No one stopped what they were doing. But they noticed her. They always noticed. She kept her face neutral, moving through the station with her shoulders squared, her pace steady. Act like nothing's changed. She headed toward her desk, but the weight of the room felt different now. Heavier. Judging. She wasn't sure if it was real or imagined, but it didn't matter. She felt it all the same. Her desk looked just as she had left it. Papers neatly stacked. A pen she had placed down 60 days ago, still sitting exactly where she had left it. For a moment, she just stood there. Then, slowly, she set her things down. And that was when she saw the shadow pass. It was barely a flicker in her peripheral vision, but she knew exactly who it was. Nathaniel Grant. She didn't turn to face him. She didn't need to. She felt his presence as he walked past her desk, moving toward his office. He didn't pause, didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her at all. And maybe, for a split second, she thought that was how it was going to be, that he was done with her, that whatever test she had been in was over. But then, right at his office door, he hesitated. It was small, barely a second, but it was there. He turned his head just slightly, his voice even when he spoke. "Carson." Linda stiffened. "Sir." A pause. Then, "Welcome back." The words were simple. Not warm, not cruel. Just there. Linda swallowed hard. Her voice was steady when she responded. "Thank you, sir." Grant nodded once. Then, without another word, he stepped inside his office. The door clicked shut. Linda let out a slow, measured breath. She had been given a second chance. But the real question was, what would she do with it? Prejudice isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with slurs or hate speech. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it's just assumptions. The real question isn't whether or not it exists. The real question is, are you willing to face it? And if you are, what will you do about it?